So let me share with you their guidelines for revising the King James Version. And there are 16 guidelines here. The first is to retain all doctrinal and theological words unless the Greek or Hebrew clearly indicates otherwise. So what they're trying to do here is to make sure that they kept all the words that were in the King James Version that were doctrinal and theologically oriented, so that there wouldn't be a major change in words like justification and sanctification and words that have a lot of theological weight to them. Number 2, retain words for items no longer in current use. So if there's a word in the original language that we don't really have a modern equivalent for it, so the examples they give are chariot. We don't really have chariots in the U.S. today. So instead of describing that or making, kind of coming up with some sort of a alternative word, they just use the actual original word but put it in our language. The other example is phylacteries, where they would put scripture and bind it on their forehead. That is not something we have, so they just use the original word from the language they were translating from. Number 3, correct all departures from the Textus Receptus. I'm not sure exactly what they meant by this, but maybe the King James writers, maybe the King James translators didn't always follow the Textus Receptus, or maybe there were just some scholarship updates that needed to be done, and so they did that. Number 4, words that have changed meaning since 1611 should be replaced by their modern equivalents. And so that's what I was talking about with a word like matrix, or another example would be like the word conversation, which in 1611 meant your lifestyle, but today it's what we talk about. So they had to update those words. Number 5, archaic idioms should be replaced by modern equivalents. So there are idioms that the ancient Bible writers used that don't really work well in our language. So a lot of times Bible writers would talk about their bowels, to talk about their emotions, and they might say something like, I love you from my bowels. That would be kind of the idea, but that just doesn't sound very good in our language. Number 6, words and expressions that have become vulgar or indelicate in current English usage should be replaced by their proper equivalent. So if you read a word like dung, where Paul talks about I count the things that I've done before I met Jesus as dung. The New King James reviser said some of that sounds a little vulgar, so they decided to go with something less vulgar, something that would sound a little bit more proper and good etiquette in our language. Number 7, alter punctuation to conform with that currently used. So they obviously updated the quotation marks and periods and other punctuation marks in the way that we use them today. If you read the King James Bible, it can be very confusing because some of their punctuation marks just we don't use them the same way as they did back then. So the New King James updates those. Number 8, change all Elizabethan pronouns, verb forms, and other archaic words to their current equivalent. Well, that's a good thing. Now, of course, it's beautiful, and we're going to continue to have the King James Version around. So if you want to read those Elizabethan words, you can continue to pick up the King James Version and do that. It's kind of like reading the original Shakespeare. But as far as how the actual Bible writers wrote and how the people back then spoke, they were actually speaking in their common language. When Jesus spoke, he was speaking in the common language. When Paul spoke, he was speaking in the common language. So the idea there is they're saying, well, we need to try to update the language of the King James so that it's more like the common language, which is how the Bible writers were actually writing. Number 9, attempt to keep the King James word order. However, when comprehension or readability is affected, transpose or revise sentence structure. Well, the King James itself, it's a mixed bag. On one hand, the word order can make it sound beautiful, and there's a lot of poetry in there. So the New King James tried to keep that. On the other hand, some of the word order in the King James is trying to be very close to the original languages, and it can get confusing. And so the New King James tries to make it more understandable when needed. Number 10, eliminate the inordinate usage of the auxiliary verb shall. Follow current grammatical style for these changes. So, that's a minor thing in a way, but the word shall is used so much in the original King James Version, it just doesn't fit our modern language today. So that was one of the changes they made, is to not use the word shall so much and change that to will. Number 11, attempt to keep sentences reasonably short without affecting text or meaning. The original languages sometimes had very long sentences. I know, for example, in Greek, when Paul is writing, he will sometimes write these really long sentences and use what are called participle phrases, one after another. And so that can just get to be a really, really long sentence. The King James sometimes kept those really long sentences, and it could be hard to understand. The New King James said if it gets to be too long, we want to try to separate that out into different sentences. And that helps just to make the meaning a little bit more understandable. Number 12, attempt to use words that avoid misunderstanding. So again, there are words in the King James Version that maybe years ago meant one thing, but today means something very different. And sometimes we can misunderstand because the word usage has changed so much. Number 13, when making corrections, use other words already represented by the same Greek or Hebrew word in the King James if possible. What I like about this one is what they were saying is we're going to sometimes have to change a word. It was translated this way. But if we're going to change the word, we're going to continue to try to use the vocabulary of the original King James translators. If they started using words that are more modern, it just wouldn't fit. Even though we might understand it today, but it wouldn't fit the style of the original King James Version. So they really tried to use the vocabulary, even if they were using a different word, use the vocabulary of the original King James translators. Number 14, capitalize all personal pronouns referring to deity. That's an interesting one because the original King James Version, when it referred to God as Him, it wouldn't capitalize Him. If it referred to Jesus as He, it wouldn't capitalize He. Whereas the New King James decided to do that out of respect for deity. But the downside of doing that, as many have pointed out, is that there are places where you read where you're not sure in the original language if it's referring to God or not. Or there may be a prophecy that could refer to Jesus, maybe not. It becomes a judgment call. So then when you capitalize the pronouns, you're actually in some way becoming an interpreter rather than just a translator, because the original language didn't capitalize those pronouns. But that being said, that's just a judgment call. Some translations do that, some don't. And it is something a lot of Christians do, but not all. Number 15, proper names should agree with Old Testament when possible. So in the King James Bible, some of you have noticed this, a name like in the Old Testament, Isaiah, in the New Testament will be Isaias. And I think that's based on the actual original languages and probably influenced by Latin because of when the King James was written. But it gets confusing, and it's actually more accurate and understandable just to keep the names the same in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So if we have Isaiah in the Old Testament, you'll see Isaiah in the New Testament when you're reading the New King James. Number 16, all obsolete and archaic words as defined by one or more recognized dictionaries should be replaced by their current equivalents. This applies to phrases and idioms as well. So if the dictionaries are defining it as archaic and obsolete, then they're going to be replaced by their current equivalents. And that refers to words as well as phrases and idioms. So they really wanted to make sure it was updated for today's language. Again, what I love is it is updated, but it's not a fad translation. And what I mean by that is I think some translations obviously really are just very geared toward a particular time period. And so they don't last as long, and they don't retain their popularity as long. Other translations, like the New International Version, they've been very good, but when they've done updates, they've really changed a lot of things. And actually, that was kind of created a lot of stir in the New International Version community with the way that they updated that version. Other translations, it's not so much that they're making big changes, but they're updating them pretty often. And the problem for me with that is, if you say, I want to use the ESV, and you're using the ESV 2011, and then 5 years later, they've updated it. And of course, they have their reasons for doing that. But then, every 5 years or so, you're like, okay, my Bible doesn't read exactly the same way as other people's Bibles because they update it so often. The New King James Version updated the King James Version after hundreds of years, and it was finished in 1982, and they haven't updated it since. And I find that to actually be a really good thing. That the New King James Version is going to be the same for a long time. And so you don't have to worry about anything being changed in it. So that just gives you some of my reasons for loving the New King James so much. It also gives you a little bit of a background as to how they went about creating the New King James Version. If you're looking for a Bible translation and you have any questions, please feel free to ask me any question that you have in the comments. And I would definitely recommend, if you're looking for a good translation, the New King James is one that you definitely would be good. It would be good for you to have it. I hope this has been helpful to you, and thanks so much for watching A Fresh Perspective.